Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever wondered what's actually happening inside a piece of metal? Like right at that exact fraction of a second before it bends, warps, or just completely fails? Well, today we're going to objectively map out this really fascinating micro to macro journey. We'll look at how atomic level defects literally dictate the exact moment a material yields under stress. It's this brilliant story of geometry, kinetics, and thermodynamics. Okay, let's dive right into our structural roadmap. We'll be moving progressively from the mechanics of line defects and expanding loops, up through planar confinement and cross-slip, kinetics and out-of-plane motion, and finally capping it off with CRSS and macroscopic yield. Section 1. Mechanics of line defects, the geometry of deformation. So to really understand macroscopic yield, we've got to first establish the fundamental kinematics of the two primary 1D defects, edge and screw dislocations. Take a look at the edge dislocation here. Notice those goldenrod arrows pushing on the block? Those represent our applied shear stress. Now, if you trace that magenta vector, which defines that extra half-plane of atoms wedged into the lattice, you'll see that as the shear stress is maintained, the edge dislocation shifts and translates step by step. And crucially, it moves strictly parallel to that applied force. But then, in stark contrast, we have the screw dislocation. While the shear stress is applied in the exact same orientation, again, check out those goldenrod arrows, the screw dislocation actually shears the lattice blocks in a sort of tearing motion. Because of its helical geometry, it migrates orthogonally, so it's moving perfectly perpendicular to that exact same applied stress vector. Right, so the crucial takeaway here is this strict geometric rule that governs these foundational defects. We get parallel motion for pure edge components and perpendicular motion for pure screw components, all under the exact same shear stress. You'll definitely want to keep this rule in mind because it really dictates everything that follows. Moving on to Section 2, expanding dislocation loops, initiation to yield. Let's see what happens when these individual pure components merge into expanding, continuous structures. In reality, macroscopic shear doesn't just happen with a single straight line moving across a block. It relies on a life cycle with 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 is the initial formation of a continuous line under shear stress. Phase 2 is the expansion of that loop, with the edge and screw components moving on their different trajectories. And finally, Phase 3 is yield, which happens as the loop actually reaches the crystal boundary. This expanding loop concept brilliantly illustrates that exact 3-step life cycle in action. You can see it initiating, sweeping outward kind of like a ripple on a pond, and then breaking the surface at Phase 3. The complete life cycle of that expanding loop ultimately leaves behind a permanent macroscopic deformation step of exactly 1 Burger's vector. And honestly, it's wild to think that this tiny atomic step is the fundamental building block of massive structural changes. Section 3, planar confinement and cross-slip, obstacles in 3D space. As these loops expand outward, they aren't just cruising down an empty highway. They've got to navigate a really complex 3D space, full of microscopic obstacles. But before we talk about dodging obstacles, we need to quickly define the primary slip plane. Think of this as the specific 2D surface that an edge dislocation is geometrically locked to during motion. It's basically a rigid, highly restrictive track. And because of that track, edge dislocations suffer from a pretty severe limitation: strict planar confinement. That magenta vector is physically trapped on its primary slip plane. So if an edge dislocation bumps into a rigid precipitate or some obstacle right in the middle of this plane, it can't just maneuver around it in 3D space. It is completely stuck on the tracks. It either has to forcefully cut through the obstacle or halt entirely, which essentially stops the deformation process cold. But luckily, there's a loophole here. This brings us to a highly advantageous alternative called cross-slip. This is an out-of-plane maneuver where a dislocation can actually pivot onto an intersecting plane to just bypass the obstacle altogether. So, who gets to use this slick maneuver, the screw dislocation? Because its dislocation line and Burger's vector are parallel to one another, pure screw components aren't bound to a single plane. They can uniquely pivot onto an intersecting cross-slip plane. This lets them gracefully bypass those microstructural obstacles that would have permanently pinned an edge dislocation. It is a massive advantage for 3D mobility. Section 4. Kinetics and out-of-plane motion, the thermodynamic response. Now, moving beyond pure geometry, we have to mathematically quantify how these defects respond to real-world variables. Because as it turns out, dislocation glide is not a perfectly continuous, smooth ride. This empirical equation shows us that the velocity of dislocation glide is heavily dictated by the applied shear stress relative to a reference threshold. And this is all modified by material-specific constants. Basically, things like crystal purity, thermal energy, and applied stress dynamically dictate exactly how fast these defects are ripping through the lattice. Now remember how edge dislocations lack that convenient cross-slip maneuver? Well, they do have a workaround, but it requires a ton of thermal energy. Since they can't just slip out of plane, they rely on a diffusion-controlled process to either shrink by absorbing vacancies, which we call positive climb, or extend by expelling lattice atoms, known as negative climb. This non-conservative motion is highly temperature-dependent, functioning kind of like a delicate seesaw. Unlike normal glide, climb really dominates at high temperatures. It's this specific process of vacancy absorption or expulsion that finally grants that stubborn edge dislocation some out-of-plane mobility, allowing it to bypass blockages. Section 5. CRSS and macroscopic yield, the climax of plastic deformation. All right, we are finally ready to synthesize all of these microscopic mechanics to witness the exact climax of macroscopic yielding. Take a really close look at the sharp vertical wall on this graph. This spike represents the critical resolved shear stress, or CRSS, which triggers plastic flow. Notice how, right at this specific threshold, the dislocation velocity doesn't just increase steadily, it shoots up exponentially across several orders of magnitude with practically zero additional stress. Breaking this down a bit further, first off, edge components consistently outpace screw components at an equal stress level just before reaching that yield state. Secondly, that vertical wall represents the fundamental onset of plastic deformation. CSRS is literally the exact moment the macroscopic lattice surrenders and yields. To pull all of this together, we have this dislocation mobility matrix. It neatly maps out every constraint and kinetic response that differentiates our two 1D defects. Edge dislocations glide parallel to applied stress with higher velocity, but they're locked to that primary slip plane and require high-temp decancy climb to move out of plane. Meanwhile, screw dislocations glide perpendicularly at a lower velocity, but they're capable of 3D cross-slip right out of the box. As this matrix overview confirms, accurately predicting macroscopic failure isn't just about knowing these dislocations exist. It requires materials experts to meticulously track how all of these vastly different mobility mechanisms interact with 3D microstructural obstacles simultaneously. It's like a giant, incredibly complex puzzle. Which leaves us with a pretty compelling final thought for today's explainer. If macroscopic yield is entirely governed by the kinetics of 1D line defects, how might we engineer new microstructural obstacles to completely arrest this motion? If we can perfectly design materials that stop edge climb and screw cross-slip dead in their tracks, could we create unprecedentedly strong, nearly unbreakable materials? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this structural journey, and I hope this gives you a whole new perspective on the materials all around us.